I am an enthusiastic hiker, rock climber, and cave explorer, living on the outskirts of a vast national park that is perfect for all three activities. During my last hike, I followed a short, steep trail that wound through a section of the forest, taking about 2 hours in total. Near the end of the route, I noticed a small, dark opening in the rock formation, about 60 yards away from the main trail. My curiosity led me to investigate, and it appeared to be a fairly standard cave for the area. I pulled out my flashlight and inspected the entrance for a moment, when I noticed a narrow crevice emerging from the shadowy right corner. It was an opening to a new cave system below. I parked at the edge of the forest and made my way up the trail, excited to explore a new location. Despite having hiked this track many times over the years, I had never noticed this cave before. The prospect of discovering a new cave system below thrilled me. The muddy trail was soft from the morning dew under my feet as I approached the cave. I left the main trail and waded through overgrown grass and bushes. My eager pace slowed as I eyed the cave entrance with suspicion. It was loosely covered by branches and foliage. I moved the various branches and vines aside and switched on my flashlight. I illuminated the opening, ensuring that no one was using it as a temporary shelter. It was empty. Although it felt strange, I thought perhaps another hiker had stumbled upon this hidden gem and wanted to keep it to themselves. As I crouched and gradually made my way inside, I could hear faint dripping noises from condensation above. I stood at the edge of the narrow crevice, peering over the lip into the darkness. My flashlight revealed a massive cavity below, approximately 70 to 80 feet deep. I prepared my harness, secured myself to the cave wall, and ensured everything was in place when I heard something echoing up from below. It sounded like muffled shouting or screaming, but it could have easily been water or wind reverberating off the walls. It's amazing how far sound travels in enclosed spaces. I switched from the flashlight to my headlamp and began my descent. As I eased my way down, the bottom appeared brighter than I expected. When my feet touched the floor, I looked back up at the sunlit gap above. I unhooked myself from the tether and switched back to my flashlight. I glanced around. The area looked more like a large tunnel than an enclosed cave. The normally uneven ground was surprisingly flat and empty. I noticed that the concave walls were lined with dim lantern-style lights, which only intrigued me further. Cautiously, I wandered forward until I reached a slight bend. Once, again, I was hit with echoing shouts and screams, and this time I was sure they were definitely human voices. They weren't the kind of shouts you'd expect from construction workers or an exploration party. No, they sounded much more sinister. My pure adventurous excitement was replaced by an unsettling feeling of dread. I looked at my cell phone, knowing it had no signal, but it was a nervous habit I had when I felt alone. After about 5 minutes of walking, my flashlight beam hit a jagged wall ahead. The lights on either side of me faded into darkness as I reached a T-junction. I looked left and right. Both paths led into obscurity. Suddenly, a wave of petrified screams erupted from the left, causing me to swing my body over and scan the area. On the gritty rock and limestone dust below, I noticed thin tire tracks. Regrettably, I decided to follow the cries, thinking perhaps a group of people had gotten into trouble down here. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The further I walked, the louder and more violent the cries became. I reached a sharp corner and switched my flashlight off, peering nervously around. The narrow tunnel opened into a massive, lit cavern. I gasped, my face contorting in horror at the scene unfolding before me. 4 large floodlights illuminated dozens of metal bar cages, each containing 10 to 12 men, women, and children. Shockingly, they were being guarded by military personnel. Fully armed guards patrolled around the cages. Many of the helpless individuals inside were hysterically crying and comforting each other, while others appeared shell-shocked, staring blankly into space. Most wore dirt-stained and torn clothing, and many looked unwell. My eyes darted upwards as a red light flashed on the cave ceiling. Everyone slowly turned their heads up as a siren blared from a small loudspeaker in one corner. This was quickly followed by a mass of gasps, then the screaming resumed. A deep rumbling sound emerged from the far end of the cave, like something heavy being dragged along the floor. 4 military guards began pushing a cage full of people toward a dark point on the far side, which seemed to slope into another part of the cave. The trapped occupants began to pray and plead with the enforcers to stop, but their cries fell on deaf ears. The shrieks of help filled the air, and distress was visible on the faces of the onlookers. The guards led the captives into the darkness, and after a few moments of silence, a heavy, fast-paced sound echoed from the shadows. The 4 military personnel sprinted out, and what followed were horrific screams from the doomed captives, accompanied by the harsh sounds of metal twisting and snapping. The screams soon faded, replaced by snarling noises and what I could only describe as flesh being torn apart. Then, with a crash, the mangled cage came flying from the abyss, now blood-stained and empty. As the dust settled around it, mass hysteria erupted. The low rumbling noise sounded out once more as the ground vibrated. I couldn't believe what I had witnessed. These were our military personnel, dehumanizing people and leading them to their certain death. They were feeding them to whatever monsters lurked below. I needed evidence, as no one would believe me. My hands shook in fear and shock as I took out my cell phone, trying to capture a photo. In my panic, I forgot to turn off the flash, and several guards turned their rifles in my direction. I turned to run, dust kicking up behind me as chaos ensued. As I sprinted, the lights grew brighter until the entire cave was engulfed in light. I ran faster, the sound of my harness clinking resonating around me. My shallow breaths echoed off the limestone walls as I nearly missed the turn where I had entered. I skidded around the corner, catching my hand on a jagged rock. I winced in pain, but adrenaline kept me moving. I reached the tether and quickly clipped myself in, my blood-covered hands slipping as I tried to hoist myself up. I gained momentum and started to see daylight streaming through the rock opening. I could hear shouting and footsteps from the depths below. Someone yelled, "He went this way," while another voice shouted, "Now, cut them!" It then went pitch black below me as they turned off the lights just as I grasped onto the rocks above. I strained and squeezed myself out of the tight space, blood slowly running down my arm. My legs scrambled over the ledge just as beams of light flooded the space underneath. I held my breath as one of the soldiers shouted out, "Clear!" I exhaled while slumping to the floor, trying to make sense of the last hour. Before I could compose myself, a voice barked out, "Up! Up! Up!" I jolted to my feet as 6 bright red lasers streamed through the dusty opening, hitting the wall above. I stumbled frantically out of the cave, not stopping until I reached my car. I grabbed the first aid kit from my bag and wrapped a bandage around the bloody gash on my hand. I called my brother while driving home, telling him what had happened, but he didn't believe me. Sam told me to stop messing with him, as he was busy, and hung up. I got home and took care of my wounds. Luckily, they looked worse than they were. I tossed and turned all night, thinking about those poor people, many of whom looked like they had just been picked off the streets. The next morning, Sam came over, and I showed him my hand, telling him every detail, including the photo I took. Finally, he began to see I was telling the truth. He said we had to show someone. I was hesitant, explaining that it was the military running it and that they had seen me take a photo. Sam then came up with an idea. We would park nearby and use his drone to check it out. I agreed. We drove over and parked at the side of the road, a lump forming in the back of my throat as Sam set up the drone. I directed him to where the cave was located. We both anxiously watched his tablet, which was streaming the drone footage. I saw the overgrown patch outside the cave and gestured for Sam to turn towards the cave opening. I muttered in disbelief, "What?" The cave entrance was now blocked by loose rocks and rubble. The entire rock face appeared to have caved in. The camera footage then swerved and fell towards the ground. The screen went black, then signal lost. Something had happened to the drone. We both scrambled back into the car, and I drove home, dropping Sam off on the way. As night fell, I noticed the black car parked across the street from my house. It looked to have two people inside, both wearing suits. I studied it through my blinds, wondering what they were doing there. They were just sitting, staring straight ahead. Then suddenly they both turned toward me. I recoiled back, the blinds snapping shut just as I heard the engine start. The car then sped off. The next morning I went into work. Halfway through my journey, I saw a black car in my rearview mirror. I couldn't tell if it was the same one, but it definitely seemed to be following me. I decided to check it out, making 4 immediate right turns, and it mirrored my every move until the last turn. The driver must have realized what I was doing and turned off just before I made it. I parked slightly away from the office, just so it wasn't obvious where I was. As I settled into my day, I felt increasingly paranoid. If this was the government, they would know exactly where I was located and what I was doing. I went into various meetings throughout the day as normal, but as it neared 3 o'clock, I had a knock at my office door. It was the receptionist, Kelly. She said something strange had happened earlier in the day. She explained that 2 tall men, dressed in black suits and wearing fedora hats, had come into the office insisting to speak with me. They were prepared to wait. Kelly told them I was out in meetings for the rest of the day, and she described feeling a strange, unnerving sensation about them. The most peculiar part was that they looked like identical twins. I thanked her for the information, realizing she had done the right thing. I looked back at the security camera footage. I could see 2 men walk in, speak with Kelly, and leave within 10 to 15 minutes. They were tall, bald, and had similar features. My heart raced as I realized that whoever was behind that underground operation knew my identity. I left early, claiming a headache, and drove home. As I pulled down my street, I saw the black car parked outside my house again. The 2 men inside stared intently at me as I passed. Time seemed to slow as I felt their gaze follow me until I reached my front door. I rushed inside, feeling a sense of dread. I walked through to the dining room and noticed a small envelope on the table. My paranoia peaked as I wondered if they had been inside my house. I opened the envelope to find 6 photos of me, all taken within the cave system. I felt sick. Whoever was behind this would not let me live knowing what I had seen. I didn't go into the office the next day, fearing for my safety. I stayed glued to my chair, staring at the photos, trying to figure a way out of this mess. As evening approached, headlights streamed through my window, and the black car returned. It parked outside my house, and the 2 men stepped out, walking toward my front door. I watched in terror through my blinds. 3 loud knocks rattled my door. I still haven't answered it. I can't. Everything has gone silent. Too silent. I'm barricading the doors, hoping to survive the night. If I make it, I'll try to get more answers.